The Dark Scrolls. Some men are born under the heavy burden of a crown. Others claw their way to it, fueled by ambition or desperation. But Ferdinand VII of Spain emerged into this world as if fate itself was determined to fashion a king whose every instinct would run contrary to dignity and restraint. If history is a theater of cruelty, Ferdinand was one of its most fascinating performers, a man whose appetite for control and carnal pleasure left an entire kingdom reeling. It began with a childhood steeped in suspicion and betrayal. Even before he could walk, Ferdinand was surrounded by a court seething with intrigue. His father, Charles IV, was not a strong monarch but rather a docile puppet for powerful favorites, particularly Manuel Godoy, a cunning statesman whose rise to prominence made the royal family the subject of ridicule and rumor. The boy watched as his father surrendered authority, and his mother maneuvered behind closed doors, sowing seeds of bitterness. Spain in those years was a faltering empire. The glow of the Americas was fading, the treasury was bleeding, and revolution simmered across Europe. Ferdinand's formative memories were filled with whispered conspiracies, portraits of kings past gazing down in silent disappointment, and a constant sense that power was slipping away. While other children learned to hunt or ride, Ferdinand learned to eavesdrop. He learned to pretend. He became fluent in the language of duplicity, a talent that would define his adult life. As he grew into adolescence, he cultivated a cold demeanor that concealed deep insecurities. He saw how Godoy overshadowed his father's authority and possibly even his mother's affections. In the cloistered corridors of the palace, rumors were currency, and Ferdinand amassed a treasury of grievances. He came to view himself as the only rightful bulwark against his family's decay, a savior by necessity. By the time he reached manhood, Ferdinand had grown into a pale, heavy-eyed figure, with an expression that seemed to repel warmth. His education was haphazard at best. Tutors were dismissed for offending his pride or contradicting his suspicions. He developed an unshakable conviction that he was destined to cleanse Spain of corruption, yet he never questioned the possibility that he, himself, might be the greatest contagion. This quiet hostility soon turned to active conspiracy. When Napoleon's star rose over Europe, Ferdinand imagined an opportunity. He began plotting to overthrow his father and Godoy. The scheme was bold, some called it treasonous, but in Ferdinand's mind it was the act of a patriot. He secretly courted the French emperor's favor, believing that Napoleon would help him seize the throne in exchange for loyalty. His plans unraveled in 1807, when correspondence revealing his intrigues fell into royal hands. Confronted by his father and Godoy, Ferdinand did not deny his betrayal. He prostrated himself, sobbed, and begged for forgiveness, another performance in which he was well practiced. He was briefly imprisoned and humiliated, but the episode only strengthened his conviction that the throne was his birthright and that any deception was justified to claim it. By 1808, Napoleon's appetite for conquest finally reached Spanish soil. Under the guise of arbitration, French forces occupied key fortresses and marched towards Madrid. Charles IV, already weary and discredited, abdicated. Ferdinand seized the moment, stepping forward as the new monarch. The Spanish people erupted in celebration, believing that the treacherous Godoy was gone, that the weak Charles had been toppled, and that Ferdinand would restore the nation's dignity. For a brief flicker in history, Ferdinand VII became the embodiment of Spanish hope. Crowds shouted his name, prayers were offered for his reign. Yet, behind closed doors, the young king was nothing more than a pawn in Napoleon's colossal game. Napoleon summoned Ferdinand to Bayonne under the pretext of diplomacy. There, the French emperor revealed his true purpose. Spain would become a satellite of the French Empire. Ferdinand was forced to renounce the crown he had just stolen. It was a humiliation so complete that it left a permanent scar on his mind. He was shipped into exile while Joseph Bonaparte, Napoleon's brother, was installed as the puppet king. Back in Spain, outrage exploded into insurrection. The Peninsular War ignited a brutal, grinding conflict that would consume hundreds of thousands of lives and unleash horrors that Spaniards would not soon forget. While his country burned, Ferdinand lingered in French custody, oscillating between pitiful pleas to Napoleon and self-pitying ruminations. To outsiders, he looked like a tragic figure, a prince robbed of his throne by a foreign tyrant. But to those who studied his record, it was hard to pity him for long. The seeds of disaster had been planted by Ferdinand's own duplicity and short-sighted ambition. Still, exile was not the end of his story. In 1813, the tide turned. Napoleon's empire began to collapse under the weight of endless wars. When the French retreated, Ferdinand was released and permitted to return to Spain. It was a moment ripe with possibility. Many believed he might finally emerge as a wiser, humbled monarch ready to rebuild. But Ferdinand VII was no wiser. He had learned nothing. If anything, his time in captivity had distilled his worst qualities into a purer form. He returned not as a liberator, but as an embittered, spiteful king determined to punish anyone he suspected of disloyalty. This was the man who would earn his reputation as perhaps the most perverse monarch of his age, not simply because he pursued depravity in his personal life, but because he was determined to warp the entire kingdom to suit his cravings. And the kingdom, exhausted by years of war and famine, would be too weak to resist him. When Ferdinand re-entered Spain in 1814, the nation teetered between ruin and revolution. The people who had once cheered his name now stared in disbelief at the devastation left by the French occupation. Whole provinces had been reduced to scorched earth. Entire families vanished in the chaos. Guerrilla fighters, hailed as heroes, stalked the roads with the same ruthlessness as the French troops they had resisted. Amid this wreckage, there was a single ember of hope, the liberal constitution of 1812, drafted in Cadiz during Ferdinand's absence. It was the most progressive charter Spain had ever known, abolishing feudal privileges, enshrining civil liberties, and placing limits on royal power. Many believed it could guide the nation back to stability. But Ferdinand loathed it. He viewed the Constitution as an insult, a usurpation of divine monarchy. For a man who had spent his life scheming to claim the throne, any constraint on his authority was intolerable. When he crossed the border, thousands of Spaniards lined the roads to greet him, waving banners that read, "Long live the constitutional king." But Ferdinand's heart was already set on betrayal. In a performance both cynical and theatrical, he publicly proclaimed his gratitude to the liberal deputies who had carried the country through the war. He swore loyalty to the Constitution. Then, in private, he plotted its destruction. On May 4th, 1814, Ferdinand issued a declaration voiding the Constitution entirely. He ordered the arrest of its authors, the dispersal of the Cortes, and the restoration of absolute monarchy. Some deputies who had risked everything to defend Spain were dragged in chains to prison or exile. Others fled the country, convinced the king was not merely reactionary, but pathologically vindictive. With the apparatus of repression reinstated, Ferdinand set about remaking the court in his own warped image. He surrounded himself with sycophants and informants. He revived the Inquisition's powers, eager to police not just political dissent, but moral life itself. Yet, behind the facade of pious restoration, his private appetites were unrestrained. In the royal apartments, Ferdinand's perversions took on a theatrical quality. He staged elaborate entertainments that blended politics and depravity, masked balls where he might summon courtiers' wives or daughters to dance for his amusement. If he was displeased with a performance, He humiliated them without hesitation. Though chroniclers disagreed on the full extent of his excesses, most agreed he was driven by a sadistic delight in debasement. He relished reducing proud nobles to trembling petitioners. Women of the court quickly learned that refusing the king's advances meant not only disgrace, but potential ruin for their families. In this way, he transformed sexual coercion into a lever of power. It was not enough for Ferdinand to be obeyed. He wanted to be feared, to feel that he could violate any boundary without consequence. His private chambers became a hidden theater of intimidation, a place where cruelty masqueraded as royal prerogative. While he indulged these appetites, the Spanish people bore the consequences of his tyranny. Famine spread through the countryside. The treasury, already depleted, hemorrhaged money to maintain a swollen bureaucracy of spies and censors. Commerce withered under the weight of arbitrary decrees. And yet Ferdinand maintained an almost theatrical pose of piety. He ordered masses to be said for the souls of those who died resisting the French. He had statues of the Virgin paraded through Madrid in solemn processions. But in the same breath he condemned reformers to death or imprisonment, branding them enemies of God and crown. His hypocrisy was legendary. When foreign diplomats visited, he played the contrite monarch, lamenting the burdens of kingship. Behind closed doors, he ranted about conspiracies that only he could see. His paranoia was bottomless. Every whisper became a plot, every murmur a rebellion. In 1820, after 6 years of unrelenting repression, the dam finally burst. Colonel Rafael del Riego led a military uprising that demanded the restoration of the Constitution of 1812. The revolution spread like wildfire. Garrisons mutinied. Towns declared for the liberal cause. Ferdinand, shocked and cornered, capitulated once again. He signed decrees acknowledging the Constitution and agreed to convene the Cortes. But even as he affixed his signature, he plotted to overturn it by any means necessary. This was the hallmark of Ferdinand's rule: perform compliance to buy time, then betray his promises the instant it was safe. The next 3 years became known as the Triennio Liberal, or the Liberal Triennium, a fragile experiment in constitutional government. But Ferdinand never stopped conspiring to destroy it. He sent secret appeals to other European monarchs, begging for intervention. He fed false intelligence to his own ministers, stoking division and confusion. In public, he pretended to be a constitutional monarch. In private, he was already planning to welcome foreign troops to crush his own people. By 1823, the absolutist powers of Europe responded. Under the sanction of the Holy Alliance, a French army called the 100,000 Sons of St. Louis invaded Spain to restore Ferdinand's unlimited authority. Once again, the king proved himself a master of duplicity. He allowed himself to be rescued, embracing the French generals as saviors. He made solemn oaths to respect the lives and liberties of those who had served the Constitution. The instant he was secure on his throne, he repudiated every word. He unleashed a wave of retribution so pitiless that it stunned even his foreign allies. Liberals were hunted down, executed, or exiled. The press was gagged, universities were purged, the Inquisition's machinery creaked back to life. This period earned its grim epithet, La Década Ominosa, the ominous decade. Ferdinand relished his vengeance. He had spent years feeling humiliated, outmaneuvered, forced to kneel. Now he reveled in the spectacle of his enemies crushed beneath his feet. If he had stopped there, perhaps history would remember him merely as another petty tyrant. But Ferdinand's private life, too, became a grotesque theater of compulsions. He married 4 times, driving each wife to the brink of despair. His need for dominance extended into the marriage bed, where he demanded rituals that blended superstition with humiliation. Some accounts claimed he forced his wives to submit to inspections and bizarre tests of purity. Others described how he subjected them all to public scrutiny, as though even their dignity was a crown he could confiscate. He was both insecure and insatiable, obsessed with producing an heir, yet apparently unable to resist cruel indulgences. His last wife, Maria Christina of the Two Sicilies, was a young woman when she became queen. She quickly realized that her husband was not merely a capricious ruler, but a man consumed by impulses she struggled to comprehend. Yet she was determined to survive where others had succumbed. In these years, Ferdinand became almost a living embodiment of Spain's agony, a sovereign who turned a kingdom's yearning for reform into a private stage for his obsessions. Under his reign, hope flickered and died, again and again, until it seemed no Spanish subject dared to trust in any promise, least of all the king's. By the late 1820s, Ferdinand VII had succeeded in crushing every liberal impulse in Spain. The country lay exhausted, its spirit bludgeoned by war, censorship, and the relentless apparatus of state terror. In taverns and private homes, people spoke of him in hushed voices, if they dared speak at all. Even foreign observers, hardened to the spectacle of European autocracy, were stunned by the peculiar blend of cowardice and cruelty that defined his rule. And yet, beneath all the rituals of power, Ferdinand remained a profoundly insecure man. No matter how many rivals he imprisoned, no matter how many decrees he signed, he was haunted by a single obsession: securing the succession. He was determined to produce a male heir who could continue his dynasty and vindicate his belief that God had destined the Bourbons to rule forever. This obsession only deepened as his health began to deteriorate. Years of gluttony, paranoia, and indulgence had left his body bloated and weak. He suffered from gout and a host of other ailments. Courtiers began to whisper that the king might not live to see another decade, and that Spain could soon erupt in civil war over who would inherit the crown. Ferdinand's first 3 marriages had produced no surviving children. When he married Maria Christina in 1829, she was more than 20 years his junior, a young woman whose beauty and composure disguised the fact that she had been handed to him like a hostage. To her, the marriage was both a duty and a sentence. She quickly discovered that her husband's cruelty was rivaled only by his desperation. He subjected Maria Christina to constant scrutiny. When she became pregnant, Ferdinand reacted with manic elation, convinced at last that God had rewarded his perseverance. For months he boasted that the child would be a boy, a prince who would silence all doubters. But in October 1830, Maria Christina gave birth to a daughter, Isabella. To Ferdinand's enemies, it seemed poetic justice that the man who had spent a lifetime imposing his will would be denied the one outcome he prized above all. But Ferdinand refused to accept defeat. Determined to prevent his brother, Don Carlos, a staunch reactionary even by Bourbon standards, from seizing the throne, he issued the Pragmatic Sanction of 1830. This decree declared that his daughter Isabella would inherit the crown, overturning centuries of Salic law that excluded women from succession. It was a fateful decision. In securing his daughter's claim, Ferdinand set the stage for the Carlist Wars, an era of civil conflict that would bleed Spain for decades. But to Ferdinand, it was unthinkable to allow anyone else to define his legacy. He would rather plunge the kingdom into chaos than admit he could not control his own dynasty's fate. As his health declined further, the king's behavior grew increasingly erratic. Some nights he demanded that priests read him the same prayers over and over, convinced that repetition would secure divine favor. Other nights he summoned musicians to play while he sipped chocolate and dictated denunciations against imaginary conspirators. Even in this state of decline, he found ways to satisfy his appetites. He insisted that Maria Christina attend to him personally, regardless of her own exhaustion or fear. Witnesses described a grim spectacle: a dying monarch whose need for humiliation and dominance did not fade as his body wasted away. In the final months of his life, Ferdinand's paranoia reached its zenith. He ordered fresh arrests, terrified that his brother Don Carlos might launch a coup before he drew his last breath. He demanded reports on the loyalty of every garrison. He interrogated ministers about the smallest rumors. Yet, beneath the panic, there was a thread of vindication. He had outlasted Napoleon. He had survived conspiracies, rebellions, and invasions. He had destroyed every reformer who dared defy him, and though he had sown the seeds of civil war, he died believing that Spain still belonged to him, and that his will would shape its future. On September 29, 1833, Ferdinand VII finally succumbed to his illnesses. When news of his death spread through Madrid, the city did not erupt in mourning. For many, it was a moment of grim relief, a final punctuation mark on decades of tyranny. His daughter Isabella was proclaimed queen at the age of 3. Even before she could understand her inheritance, her claim was contested by Don Carlos and his supporters. The Carlist Wars erupted almost immediately, as Spain divided between those who clung to the old order and those who dreamed of something new. In the years that followed, historians would argue over how to define Ferdinand VII. Some called him a tragic figure, an insecure man crushed by forces beyond his comprehension. Others saw him as a mere opportunist, devoid of principle and willing to sacrifice anything to gratify his vanity. But for many Spaniards, no such debate was necessary. They remembered him simply as the king who betrayed every oath he ever made, a man who turned his country into a laboratory for repression, a monarch who weaponized humiliation, not just in the bedchamber, but across an entire nation. His reign was a cautionary tale about the perils of unchecked power, about what happens when a man's most base appetites are given the force of law. And though Ferdinand fancied himself the savior of Spain, his legacy was ruin, an inheritance of division, bitterness, and despair. In the end, he was not merely the most perverted king in history because of his private debaucheries. He was perverse in the truest sense of the word, a ruler who twisted every institution, every ritual, every relationship to serve his own diseased conception of authority. And for that, Spain would pay the price for generations. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more.